In the second video of Module 17, we consider karst surface features. Well, let's look at some typical karst topography. This is a view of Kentucky, that undulating landscape covered with sinkholes. We'll talk a little bit about sinkholes in just a minute. So this is what you might experience in much of the U.S. Outside the U.S., karst topography can look very different. This is called tower karst in China, these large mini mountains, if you will. So we'll talk about the various types of karst topography and use examples from all around the world. Well, we'll jump in and talk a little bit about a couple of specific types of karst landscape sinkholes. This would be more representative of what we saw in the slide about Kentucky. Sinkholes are cavities caused by water erosion. So water may remove just a little bit of limestone and leave a depression, or it may do more work, and we'll look at some examples in just a moment of some specific types of sinkholes that increase in levels of their disruption to human activities, if you will. So there are three types of sinkholes that I want to mention: solution sinkholes, cover subsidence sinkholes, and cover collapse sinkholes. So let's look at the difference for just a moment. We'll start with solution sinkholes. These are sinkholes that happen where limestone is carried away by slightly acidic water with just a little bit of carbonic acid in it. Often that comes from water coming in contact with vegetation. So we have just water with a very low amount of acidic content that removes some limestone and leaves a depression. So quite often you can see small ponds will fill these places where you have some limestone that's been removed. So solution sinkholes are oftentimes represented by ponds on the landscape. And an example of a solution sinkhole in South Florida. Florida is a state that's just covered with sinkholes. There was a time period in the 1980s where they had sinkholes appearing almost every day. So it's a state that has a lot of limestone and a lot of sinkholes. Let's look at the second type, cover subsidence sinkholes. So this is a little bit different. This is, I guess you could say, a little bit more extreme. This is where granular particles settle into openings that where a little bit of that carbonic acid has removed some of the bedrock and began to form an opening. So some of those granular particles sort of settle into that opening and deepen over time. So you have sort of a column of overlying sediments that kind of settles into that opening, and it creates a deeper sinkhole. So as materials dissolve, they form that depression. There may be some kind of an underground cavity down below where some of that material may be transported, and you get a sinkhole that moves progressively downward with erosion and deepens over time. Here's an example of one of these types of subsidence sinkholes. And you can sort of see in the diagram here, kind of represents that idea that material is carried downward. So in the case of the solution sinkhole, really nothing is moving downward, but in this sinkhole, you definitely have some activity that deepens the sinkhole over time. So these can be somewhat hazardous to human activities. Well, the third type of sinkhole is the most damaging in terms of human activities, and that's the cover collapse sinkhole. So let's look at how that's different. You might kind of start with this subsidence sinkhole. In this example, we have some clay above bedrock is transported down, so you have a bigger cavity forming in the sort of below ground. The cavity itself will, over time, migrate upward as material is removed. And you might think of this sort of side view here. This is sort of like the ceiling or the roof of a house that becomes thinner over time. So that cavity continues to migrate upward as material is removed. And at some point, that cavity can be so large that you have a pretty thin layer of bedrock that's really between you and that cavity. And when that bedrock is gone, the cavity breaches, and you have this big opening that forms in the ground, and it can be pretty traumatic. Here's a sinkhole in Houston, that cover collapse sinkhole that formed in this way. So, is there a way to know that a sinkhole may be below your property? Possibly. A really a careful geological study will help you to determine that. And here's that cover collapse sinkhole shown in the view in the upper left-hand corner. A video of a sinkhole that's opened up, and So pretty traumatic view and pretty horrible if you live in a place that's affected in this way. One of the places that was affected by the sudden appearance of sinkholes, it was the National Corvette Museum in Bowling Green, Kentucky, some years ago. So this is the appearance of the National Corvette Museum before they discovered that there was a massive sinkhole below the museum site. So you have some very expensive cars, certainly those who are operating this museum were not aware that there was a sinkhole forming underneath the museum. And one day they came in and discovered this massive sinkhole had removed much of the museum and actually swallowed up several very expensive cars. Kind of a horrible thing. And if you go to the museum today, you can still see the hole. They've left it there, and some of the cars that weren't recoverable, they've left down in the sinkhole just to show you what happened. Here's a sinkhole in Germany. This was a really big one, 200 feet across, 80 feet deep. Just to kind of show you some examples of some really big sinkholes. A lot of the ones on this list are in China, but a few are in Europe and elsewhere in the Pacific Islands like New Guinea, and one shown in this list in Mexico. So these are pretty deep in terms of their size. Here's one of the biggest sinkholes in the United States. This is the Winter Park sinkhole near Orlando. This one consumed a car dealership, or at least part of a car dealership. There was a group that called this one Big Bertha. And I'm showing on the map right here, these blue dots that cover Florida represent some sinkholes, some of the bigger sinkholes that have opened up, mostly in central Florida. So how can you make the most of your sinkhole? Here's one example. You can maybe put it into some sort of home garden. All right, moving on. Let's talk about some other karst landscapes, more similar to that view, that early view of that Chinese city that I showed is tower karst. So tower karst is sort of the extreme version of karst topography, where you could think of it this way: the sinkholes have sort of deepened over time, and the landscape is really radically changed by this chemical weathering process. So we call this the stone forest or tower karst in this part of China. So I'm going to walk you through sort of the evolution of a karst landscape. So here we have stage one. This is more similar to the views of Kentucky that we looked at a few minutes ago. So this is where Kentucky is today, with some sinkholes, lost rivers or deranged rivers that sort of disappear, where a river flows and just sort of disappears into a sinkhole. So this is Kentucky, stage one. And here's a view of these coalescing sinkholes near Rocky Hill, Kentucky, so you can get sort of an idea. Stage two is similar to Cuba's Vinales Valley, and I'll show you an example of that in a picture here in a second. But these hums or magotes are left as sort of high objects. So you see the higher places here are those remnant landscapes like the hums and these higher elevation areas, and the sinkholes have sort of coalesced, and as they've sort of joined together, and river valleys have formed, and so you have this sort of intermediate landscape that's sort of halfway between that sinkhole covered landscape that I showed you that is represented by Kentucky and the one in China that we'll look at in a moment. Here's the magotes of Cuba's Vinales Valley. This is also a place where some of the most popular and expensive tobacco is grown in the world for Cuban cigars, the Vinales Valley near Havana, Cuba. And there's our stage three, China's forest of 10,000 peaks. And you can see that the tower karst is really pretty pronounced here. Sort of the landscape is mostly covered by either flat or have some of these haystack hills, or also called tower karst. And here's another view, the forest of 10,000 peaks in China. One example of these hums or these towers. Just a few other examples of tower karst. This is a global geopark of China, just another type of tower karst landscape, and a few other unique limestone landscapes. This is Jamaica's cockpit country, showing a whole lot of sinkholes and sort of these hums or the tower karst just starting to form. And a really amazing place to visit. It's a World Heritage Site in the northern part of Vietnam near Hanoi. This is one of my photos from Halong Bay. Just an absolutely fantastic place to visit. And this is another example of where In this case, you have ocean waters or bay that forms the low point, and these towers are sort of representative of where the landscape was at one time. And if it looks like there's, you can see some caves in the side of this one Tower Karst hill. There's just these places are just riddled with caves. Are everywhere. They call these caves grottos. So here's one grotto in Halong Bay. And then if you're familiar with the movie Avatar, the cloud forest in Avatar was sort of inspired by this particular location in China. So another example of Tower Karst. And then I wanted to include just a few other representative examples. Some limestone islands in Indonesia formed in a similar way. Karst topography in Croatia looks a little bit different. And then finally, if you've been to Top of the Rock near Branson, they actually had some of these cavities. Some of the caves kind of open up a little bit near Top of the Rock. The restaurant, there's a big golf resort there, so they've actually sort of cleared out some of that to sort of show off what not too long ago was actually a cave complex. And the distribution of karst landscapes worldwide, where you'd find major areas of limestone. So karst is associated with limestone topography. So here in the U.S., you see a few places here: the Ozark region shown there, the Appalachian Mountains, Florida, among other places, the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico shown on there, and then a few places in the Atlas Mountains and in Europe, and of course these places in Southeast Asia that we've been looking at in China and elsewhere.